History 102, Lecture 7, Rise of Totalitarianism, Part Soviet Union. In this video, we want to start talking about specific totalitarian regimes that developed in Europe in the 1920s and 30s. Again, the point here is what? In the 1920s and 30s, in Europe, it appeared that things like liberal democracy and capitalism had failed society. And so you see Europeans turning to more authoritarian, totalitarian forms of government. The first one we're going to talk about is Russia and the Soviet Union. That leader is a man named Stalin. Yeah. Stalin came to power in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and ruled the Soviet Union until the 1950s. Working with Lenin, Stalin brought about the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and by 1920 you have the Soviet Union. One of the main aspects of totalitarian regimes, any of them, most of them, is this idea of a personality cult. I hesitate to use the word cult. It's used generally a pejorative, meant pejoratively, doesn't really explain a lot of things, but it's a common word we use. What is a personality cult? It's the idea that you almost worship the dear leader. He is your leader. What he says is truth. And you kind of go with whatever he says. Stalin is an excellent example of this idea of this personality cult, where almost like all of your hopes, dreams, wishes, political ideology, ideals are seen in one man. Okay. In some ways, it can get almost to worship. Stalin's an example. Mussolini's an example. Hitler's an example. Mao in China's an example. It's just this idea that one political leader becomes the lightning rod, the person, where you'd hang a painting of him in your home. But anyways, and so you have, so it's kind of like he becomes it. It would be like if you with me, if I became your dear leader, and whatever I said about history you thought was God's truth, and you put up a painting of me in your house. So something like that. Or you would faint if you met me. That's kind of an example. Stalin developed this kind of personality cult, or this idea that, he was Russia. Kim Il-sung in North Korea is another example, kind of modern day, current day example. And so with totalitarian regimes, that's one way they stay in power, where all the hopes and success of the nation are devolved into one man, and he will save everyone. Okay, and so Stalin's an example of that. Another interesting aspect about Stalin's totalitarian regime is in totalitarian societies, every aspect of society is corrupted for the purposes of the regime. For example, Stalin in the 1930s, Stalin used the legal system, the Soviet legal system, to arrest, put on trial, and ultimately imprison and execute political opponents. And they're called show trials because he didn't just take them out and shoot them. You corrupted and used the legal system to go after your political opponents. And so that was a big thing in the 30s. It's one way Stalin abused the legal system in his country. He used the legal system to go after political opponents. I can never say it right. The Holodomor. Okay. 1932 and 33, the Soviet government under Stalin created a famine in the Ukraine which ultimately led to millions being killed. The Soviet government, for those that don't know, the Ukrainian region of that world, Russia, Soviet Union, and today Ukraine, it's like the Midwest here in the United States. It's a breadbasket. The climate, the soil, is perfect in that region for growing food. In fact, Ukraine is called the breadbasket. Well, when it was part of the Soviet Union, it was called the breadbasket of Russia. Today, it's the breadbasket of Europe. Like the Midwest here in the United States, Ukraine grows a lot of food. Probably not lately, for reasons, but generally it's the breadbasket of Europe. It's like the Midwest here in the U.S. They grow a ton of food. In the 1930s, the Soviet government confiscated the harvest in Ukraine, and instead of distributing some of it to Ukrainians, used it to stave off famine in other parts of Russia. In other parts of the Soviet Union, mainly Russia. Millions and millions and millions of Ukrainians were dead of starvation. Okay. And so that we'll get to it more later, maybe. Well, actually we won't. But when you look at what Ukrainians kind of think of Russians, it's not that's on their head. About a century ago, you have a Russian government that starved to death millions of people. All right. One uncomfortable fact that's not comfortable today, but when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, which Ukraine was a part of at the time in the 1940s, there was a good chunk of Ukrainian society that viewed the Germans as liberators. This Holodomor is one example. It's not a comfortable truth today, but one government oppresses you politically and intentionally starved you to death. The other government is freeing you from that, and so that's kind of a little fact about Ukraine that some people kind of ignore, I guess. But it's not a comfortable truth. And so, but anyway, so Stalin, the Soviet government under Stalin, literally intentionally starved millions of Ukrainians. You have the Gulag system develop. Okay, you have the Gulag system develop. It's a system of prisons in Siberia. Okay, let's put it this way: you think Nevada is desolate in some places? Go to Siberia. Okay, it's pretty desolate. Go Google pictures of Siberia. It's pretty desolate. Tens of thousands of political prisoners, political prisoners are jailed in the Gulag system. A lot of times their only crime, not liking Stalin. And so, that's how you know you have a personality cult. If you'll go to jail for not liking a political leader. Okay. Stalin's government and legal system allowed pogroms, which are organized riots against Jewish citizens and people in Ukraine. Stalin's government and legal system allowed discrimination against Jewish individuals in Russia. In a good portion of ways, Stalin doesn't like Jews just as much as Hitler doesn't like Jews. Okay. One of the other kind of crazy things or interesting things about Stalin, his totalitarian regime, is the Soviet government in the 20s and 30s, they would hide their abuses and the bad things they did from Western European and Americans who were Marxists, who were enamored of communism and Karl Marx and the Soviet Union. Stalin called them useful idiots because they were dupes. They were in Western Europe and America saying all these great things about the Soviet Union and communism, right while the Soviet government and Stalin were persecuting people, murdering people, starving people to death, jailing political opponents, stripping people of rights, destroying churches. People weren't allowed to practice their religion, Christian or Jewish or Muslim. Churches were burned down, priests were murdered, individual rights were trampled on, property was stolen. I mean, the government would come in and collectivize your farm, your property, and intentionally make you poor. And so, all these horrible abuses of the Stalin regime, Stalin would create Potemkin villages. There are these fake villages that looked really nice. Western journalists, writers, would come and see this, and then go back to Europe and America and say how great it was, right while people were starving to death. These useful idiots would go back to America and Western Europe and talk about the wonders of. One writer said, "I've seen the future, and it's the Soviet Union," because he saw this very idealized propaganda, and he bought it. And so this is Stalin, the perfect example of a lot of the tactics that totalitarian regimes use. And so that's Stalin for you. Okay. And so we'll conclude on that video.